Okay, so welcome all of you. Welcome to the Juxtaposition lecture series here at the Berlin University of the Arts on contemporary cultural production. My name is Lukas Feireiss, and as part of my visiting professorship here at the school, it is my intention to push for more transdisciplinary intellectual and creative discourse beyond standard protocol by inviting various cultural producers, whether it's artists, designers, architects, or curators from all around the world to shed light on their often highly hybrid professional practices that don't really abide to a single discipline. So creative juxtapositions are at the heart of this lecture series that embraces ambivalence and complexity, diversity, contradiction, cross-pollination, and collaboration. And today, I'm super excited to have multidisciplinary visual artist Kandis Williams with us. Thank you so much for being here, Kandis. Kandis' practice spans various media, spans collage, performance, writing, publishing, and curating. And she explores and deconstructs critical theory around race, nationalism, authority, and eroticism. Thereby, her work focuses especially on the body as a site of experience which is simultaneously co-opted as a symbol. Kandis is also founder and editor at large of Cassandra Press, an artist-run publishing and educational platform producing printed matter, classrooms, projects, artist books, and exhibitions. And the platform's intention is to spread ideas, distribute new language, propagate dialogue centering ethics, aesthetics, femme-driven activism, and Black scholarship. Welcome, Kandis. And the screen is yours, so to speak.
Very nice to be here. I feel like, I don't know, it's always nice to start these conversations out a little bit, like by turning on the camera. So in an effort to, I guess, know a little bit more as well, like what you get out of the conversation and what you're interested in the conversation, as I do have like a super hybrid practice. It'd be nice to talk a little bit before jumping into the images. I have a slideshow. That I prepared, and then, sorry, I'm sitting next to my hissing radiator, so it'll always be a sound competition. But yeah, and then I can show two recent performances, I guess. I'll just take you through sort of like my Cassandra practice, my collage practice, two-dimensional work, into the theatrical work and dramaturgical work that I've been doing for the past 10 years. So yeah, I guess some opening questions would be really nice. If anyone is so brave.
Any one of you? Okay, let me break the ice, because it's always a tough start for the students. And with a very simple one, you lived in Berlin for a long time, haven't you?
Yeah, for a really long time.
Like,
12 years.
For what?
About 12 years.
12 years, okay, wow. So that's usually what we already call a Berliner here. I'm a natural born Berliner, but usually after 7 years you get like the OG stamp in the city.
I left it at over OG status.
That's for sure.
Actually bartended at Panorama Bar, so it was definitely OG.
Okay, so you were at the core of things. And when was the last time you were in Berlin?
Back in a while now. I was back, I think in the last time, 2018. For a performance right outside of the Curated collection at a space called Fragile. We performed the Eroticism series there.
I saw the piece in I don't know if it's still on, in the show at Studium collection.
Yeah, she acquired a copy of the 2-channel installation.
Yeah, beautiful. There's a couple of your works actually on show there. They're very, very powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, we're continuing the Cassandra reading room into the next show as well. So we're just sorting that out now. So the reading room will stay up for the next round of exhibitions as well.
Yeah. Really has anyone of you seen the show there Fire in My Belly at the Joshua Collection, guys?
Yeah, I love that piece. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I thought so too. I mean, the whole exhibition was very powerful. It was like 30 or 40 works or 35 works that were, each single one was, I don't know, like a smack in your face. It was a very, very powerful exhibition experience. If you remember, the entire room, it's the kind of the Cassandra Press reading room.
It's great to hear. I didn't get to travel to see it, so I only saw it in floor plans. So it's very nice to hear.
No, I think it was one of the best exhibitions I've seen in a very long time.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to the next one actually as well. So they've chosen another round of readers, and we'll sort of keep reconfiguring the reading room, and hopefully also there'll be a public program as well attached to sort of like, digesting the ideas in community that the readers project.
Another opening question from any one of you?
Where are you living now?
Right now I live in between LA and New York. Traveling a lot this year, so I'm going to be based in New York this year primarily. All of you living in Berlin, is it a remote program?
It's basically everyone in Berlin, but from very many different places, but all signed up to the school in Berlin.
So you're getting to see the city, my city, huh?
Yeah.
At least a little. How is it there during lockdown?
Okay, I think compared to many other cities, I think it was easy. But I mean, it sucks. I mean, obviously, it would be nicer to be meeting in person right now. But yeah, I think relative to the experience of many other people that I know in other cities and other places in other countries, I think we're quite okay. No, it is what it is.
So interesting. I mean, I feel like Berlin, so much of the space, I mean, so much of that city was about sharing very close, especially bacterial contact with other people. It's like funny to imagine Berlin under any kind of like germ-based quarantine. Jesus. But that's really interesting. It's like it's built for so many different kinds of sequestering, so many different kinds of privacy, but that city resists that kind of privacy all the time. So it's so interesting.
That's
I wonder
true.
what the winter's like right now.
Well, the winter is always, it's gray, it's wet, and it's cold. Never a real winter, or very rarely. But what brought you to Berlin in the first place?
So strange, actually. It was kind of like early. I mean, I was really interested in performance the whole time in college as well. Like I was in Sharon Hayes, the Wally Broad class, The Question of the Document. I ended up taking that when I was in school, and really thinking through what kind of performative or theatrical elements political documents hold, and sort of what that echoes as in the political sphere. Like, so we were reading, but it was very pre-woke time. So we were reading things like, the Yes Men manifestos and stuff like that. I think Carrie Lambert Beatty was probably the only person really thinking about performance art as like almost a record of political upheaval and civil unrest. And, she wrote a book called The Seeing Difficulties. It's on Yvonne Rainer. It's on Yvonne Rainer and Rainer's practice and the sort of media culture around Rainer's practice, which I think is really good. But yeah, so Question of the Document, Waleed Rod and Atlas Group sort of raised those first artifacts, performance, archive kind of like questions. And then I took a class with Sharon Hayes. I don't even remember the title of the class. I feel like we didn't really do much in the class, actually. But thinking about sort of like staging performance and staging politics within performance art and work, and sort of like what that does or doesn't do to rally or echo or even solidify kind of like common politics or the politics that grow those practices. They were always really interesting to me. I grew up, I was in school during like, I think very early Vogue culture, or Vogue, like kind of like not early Vogue, actually like maybe the crescendo, I guess, in New York of a lot of voguing and ball culture. My cousin went to Juilliard and I went to Cooper Union, and we were the first two to go to college in our family. So we were pretty lit about that. And yeah, and just kind of all over the city in terms of like all the performance spaces that the city had to offer. I'm from Baltimore as well, so definitely grew up in a, you know, very interesting kind of milieu of various social performances. And also it's a radio city, so I grew up in a Black radio city. And that meant that everyone was connected via a very intense kind of like musical network of space and time. So, you know, if you grow up in a, if you kind of, you don't, I mean, maybe, yeah, can explain that more, like, you know, it's the whole city is listening to the same radio shows at the same time. So anywhere you go, you might hear like the same show for the hour and a half, right? Of like, so Saturday nights, Friday nights, people are listening to the radio in the club, at the house, at church, in the streets, you know. So there's like, there was a very kind of like intense, kind of like spatial, temporal, sonic community that was very invested in performance and very invested in language. And my family's Trinidadian, so we had that sort of extra sensorial kind of spatial temporal relationship also to the sonic and to language. So growing up, I was like very, very much invested in performance. And taking those early Cooper courses, I think, definitely gave me a sense of that investment. Anyway, long story short, I ended up in a really shit job being like this really crazy woman's assistant in the middle of school, and ended up being employed to like build a band for her. I had no idea really why, but it turned out that she had a residency in Wuppertal. And I shouldn't say crazy, she was fascinating. Yeah, so she had a residency in Wuppertal. I ended up building a band for her and going over to Wuppertal for what I thought would be like 3 days to help install an artwork. And through some sort of strange treachery, it ended up being something like 3 weeks. And I was like hired out to install the artwork of this entire collective in a Sparkasse in Wuppertal. So 3 weeks turned into a month. I realized that I had been sort of low-key turned into some sort of like performance installation slave kind of situation. And the manager of the Sparkasse was like, oh, this is probably really fucked up. So he actually got me a visa to work because I wasn't supposed to be there working and I wasn't allowed to really work. So he's like got an A1, like one of those like special worker visas for like a year or something like that. I was like 19, I think. I just completely didn't really, it was like one of those typical, I think, pre-woke art school situations where you don't really know the job you're hired into kind of thing. And so 3 days turned into a month. I just had no idea what to do in Wuppertal. I had a friend who was German, who was from Baltimore and lived in Berlin. And I was like, I'm going crazy here. I'm officially working for a bank. I have no idea what's going on. Like, I don't have a return ticket. My friend was like, Google my first German word, Mitfahrgelegenheit. So I got a fucking Mitfahrgelegenheit to Berlin, and I quit my job. I stayed there. I was like, this was insane. But I had this 1 year visa that meant I could work any job I wanted to, really. So I stayed in Berlin for that year and worked in bars, I did all kinds of stuff actually that first year. And I still kind of like wrote grants and did the nonprofit work. I was running a nonprofit with this person who'd hired me out to go to Berlin. So I still had access to the grants and writing grants and stuff with the nonprofit, which I did for about 5 years. And yes, and I took Bertel again. but I lived in Berlin for the next 12 years, 5 years off and on after that, and then sort of stayed there after 5 years. I got had 7 years of an artist visa.
That's a long time. So what did Berlin teach you, or like what did you take home from living in Berlin for like over a decade?
Yeah, I mean, I think Berlin was really, it's funny because I had a very dissonant experience in Berlin, let's say, because it was, you know, in so many ways so difficult to go through school in America in my body and with the concerns of my practice, to be quite honest. Like, even, as a student, I think I had, concerns within the work and it's not just, not that I can say it was just me. It was actually it was quite traumatic going through school as a Black student, especially, trying to learn about aesthetics or speak in between the lines, or even sort of rupture any of the really extremely white supremacist, extremely masculinist, sexist discourse around the art historical canon. Theoretically, ideologically, there was, it was suffocatingly opaque. And so there was also a lot, I think the last experience of sort of Me Too movement proved, there was a lot of sort of there was just everything but studying, right? Like, there was everything but sort of the philosophical and intellectual pursuits that I'd signed up for was available in school. And so there was a lot of, especially, and I think in the art world, a lot of exploitation of labor, of emotional labor. So getting through school was very difficult. I mean, I didn't really make it. Despite having, a lot of questions and a lot of sort of intellectual capacity and interest. I think the social environment of the art world in the 2010s or whenever the hell I started, early 2000s, was really, I mean, we've seen such a swinging door shift in the last 4 years, but it was very hostile. And I think Berlin taught me how to disassociate at first, it really taught me, I think there is something to sort of the collectivity, the collective kind of social catharsis of living in a city that already had its own guilt kind of packaged and socially disseminated. I was from a culture that had no dissemination of that sort of white supremacist guilt, right? We had yet to describe any sort of white supremacy in vernacular culture outside of an anomaly, right? Social anomalies of the far, far past. And I think I used to joke about it, being in the socialist shell of kind of Berlin, I could breathe a little bit more because I had white friends who knew that they were capable of being monsters, that their grandfathers were racist, that their fathers were racist, who were clear about their own white supremacist history, and couldn't, not be. So I watched that kind of culture of collective guilt that turned up on the dance floor, turned up in drug culture, turned up in all these micro cultures, right? Beautiful kind of expressions of hyper individualism, but also a collective kind of cathartic, the need for collective cathartic kind of tribalism. As an expression, I received it as this really beautiful expression of what I was not able to have in New York or in America in the context in general, which was that we were so willing to hide all the violences of our miscegenation in really dissonant language, whereas in Berlin it was kind of come one, come all, we're all fucked up, get fucked up, stay fucked up, I don't know, it's just kind of this I had never met white people like that, right? White people who would walk 3 or 4 blocks to save 8 cents on a can of beans. I had never seen real white poverty. I had never seen, I had this one bum who lived outside of a homeless guy who lived outside of the first apartment I stayed in, and he was like a homie, I did portraits of him, and he didn't want to ever come inside. At some point, I think I offered him to come take a shower, and he was like, no, I'm persona non grata. I remember thinking like, damn fool, like that's really crazy. I'd never met like, you know, any white people with valid claim to political disorganization and disenfranchisement, let's say. He was like, I'm from East Germany, I don't have a country anymore, like I don't have a home anymore. It's like valid, you know what I mean? I didn't know, I think, anything about, like, we're very deeply uneducated in American culture, so I didn't understand any of the ramifications of the Cold War to Eastern Europe, like, period. You know, I was 19, I was from New York, which I thought was the center of the world, you know, the New York of, like, the 4 years I lived in it was, you know, the center of our intellectual world as well, so there was a lot to learn, and it was also, like, I think that space of kind of like cultural guilt and cultural catharsis was really deeply palpable in like a generation like the second right before me, you know, like kind of meeting people who were maybe 10 years older than me who had seen the wall fall, you know, going to bars. And there was like like a bartender at an East German club I used to go to. It was like a really hectic gay dungeon bar. And this fool was like a Stasi sniper, you know, like it's like talking to people like that was like just like what the fuck, internalized craziness. And he was like super mean, you know what I mean? It was crazy. Huh? Fick and Dry Thousand. What's up, Charlie? Everybody go tip Charlie really well. Service.
Is that the one on Urbanstraße?
Urbanstraße, yeah. That was where I had my first solo show, actually.
Yeah, actually, I read reading your CV. I was like, what? I didn't know that one. It's nice. That's a great starting point for the first solo show, Picken 3000 on Urbanstraße. So how do you feel? You want to dive into more questions? I can ask you a million questions, or you want to kind of share some of your work with the students and then go back to the questions? How do you feel?
Keep going with the questions.
It's nice. I think we can do a mix because I have to mention this, we have like 91 students now listening. They're not familiar with your work, no, not all of them. So
I'll share the screen. Go through. I'll share this. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think you have to go on presentation mode, and then we. Yeah, this is good. Maybe we can do a mixture. You can talk, you can ask some questions, and play it like that.
Yeah, I'll just these are images from Cassandra and from my early work from 2016 to 20. It's collage work and work for Cassandra. Cassandra Press is a press that I run, and we make readers. They're collage, kind of like assemblages of various texts. These are flat works, like larger flat works I was making on Plexi. It's actually, let's keep going with the conversation. It's super boring to do this over and over again, you guys.
Yeah, it's cool, but it's nice maybe that we just, for the background, see a little bit like your visual language. I'm very familiar with your work, but maybe not all of the students. But since we just saw the collage, maybe we can talk a little bit about collage, because it's a very dear topic to me, and in a way also with this kind of lecture series, apart from all the things that I mentioned before, that we kind of are trying to celebrate, I don't know, ambivalence and complexity and, I don't know, contradiction and collaboration here. It's also about embracing like the collage or the cut-up as a contemporary model or mode of cultural production. And that doesn't necessarily mean like literally collage, but generally the kind of to the creative juxtaposition, collage and cut-up practices, they disrupt, let's say, conventional and dominant storylines and suggest new narratives. Like in a collage, it's just like 1 + 1 does not equal 2. Yeah, I was wondering how did you decide to use collage as your main means of artistic communication?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't know, I think collage...
And your camera's off again.
Oh yeah, that's okay. You can see the images though now.
Yeah, but everyone else has the camera on, so I think that we should go for it.
So I'll just go into the images. I think this is a cool image because this is one of the reader covers, and this is like a flat work. So to the left is one of the covers of the Cassandra Readers, and to the right is one of the flat works that I've made from 2017. And actually, the series is called Ricochet. So something that you said, about a collage not being 1+1 is, I think, something that I challenge directly in the collage practice. I think, collage for me has always been about almost a means of visualizing theory, and also a means of sort of like decoding political life, I guess. So thinking about what an image is and how images are constructed and how images are assigned value, assigned meaning, how they're distributed, and how they're redistributed. I think Cassandra and my collage practice at large do something really, really interesting. I think you said something like collage is a contemporary mode of cultural presentation or cultural production.
Yeah.
I think a lot about this in terms of, a real cultural shift that I've seen in the last 10, 15 years in making collages. When I came out of school, I think the way that I was putting images together, or sort of associating images, especially around understanding whiteness as a visual language, right? Like as a codification that happens via scopic regimes and via representational policy. A lot of that was really considered too nuanced, it was considered too nuanced to be seen. And so it really took and thinking about this reader, especially Faces of the Colonizer, and what the reader practice does at large, and make these readers of assembled texts, is that they trigger conversation around, I think, how to see certain collage functions, right? It's really interesting. I've gotten to work, in the last year or two, I think, especially with all these new diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and a lot of the sort of public call for more representation and Black representation in media. I've gotten to work a lot in the commercial sector, where something like this is considered, like a small part of a mood board, right? Like if I made something like this, it would be considered not even a developed mood board, right? Somehow I think there are parts of the work of making the reader that are something like doing the dramaturgical work that I've made before. But now the found image, I think I've gone through several modes now of seeing almost a serious, something that Hiro Steil would say, I guess, degradation of the image and the value of the image. I think rearing its head is NFT culture, right? But the found image and, notions of copyright around the found image, of the preservation of the subject within the found image. We play around with found text, canonical text, editorial text within the readers all the time. And I'm very well aware, of the impossibility of Cassandra as a, legal sort of business, right? It can't really be a commercial entity because of how I assembled the text, right? It's very bootleg. I'm not paying for permissions. I'm not paying for use. And so it's very different, sort of organizing classrooms now around Cassandra and the readers, and taking them out of my personal studio, and then still thinking about sort of commercial work that's being impacted by the studios of Black artists, right? Which is a real trend happening right now, where I think a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion happening in commercial spaces is happening via brands identifying Black art historical legacies, right? And turning them into content. And there's some space in between my practice and Cassandra that I think really does interrogate that understanding of collage as a mode of cultural production and interpretation, and also of liquidation, right? That rendering artistic legacy as content is another form of colonial erasure. I'm, completely sure, right? Working within modes of theater, working within performance, especially as a Black femme, but as a Black femme of not very wealthy background, I'm very aware of the, multiple sort of ethical traps and dimensions. This is the first time This is the first time I showed Eurydice as a 2-channel installation. As you can tell, the space was not a super nice white cube, right? Like a couple years ago, we were definitely in the sex club dungeon a lot, like making stuff happen. But now, this was Night Gallery, last year. So now I can sort of like, now that there's sort of public interest in a vernacular sort of like external political support to a lot of the themes of like the work, it's actually like able to be produced. And in that way, collage is like, it's not just a mode of cultural production, it's actually a mode of cultural, it's like somehow a stilt, right? It's a scaffolding to a means of like, I don't know, distribution, of financing. Like in so many ways, I'm now aware of how much my collage practice lends itself to like proposals, right? Lends itself to consultation, lends itself to like at this point, Cassandra gets almost like hired as a service to either sorting certain archives, creating curatorial praxis for or dimensions for curatorial participation of certain archives. We've been asked to go through other people's kind of images, and the Pope L reader, for instance, I think there's some images of that coming up. The Pope L reader, for instance, it's like endnotes. I did a project with them where I read Pope L's entire writing over 1977 until now, and created almost like a kind of like image or archive of like a cartography of visual citations almost, I'm still not sure if there's language around that. But yeah, we definitely operate in between. In between, I think, various kind of like modes of what the image kind of holds in terms of a space of cultural production, but also a space of like cultural erasure. So I don't know. I fuck around a lot with titles and like with making sure that titles provide another kind of scaffolding, a textual scaffolding, to maybe understanding what the image is doing or is supposed to be doing in certain images. These two images actually were somehow sold by my gallery before I had a chance to really like sit and think about them. I think I had to move or something like that. Storage. And I don't know if they was like totally ready for these to go out into the world. They're like some of the I still feel like this Albers thing is very strange that I'm still there. Yeah. Show you something. But the interest in Albers and the interest in like Du Bois and the double consciousness resonates throughout a lot of the work. It's not just his double consciousness, it's like so much of the Du Bois work. This is a lecture.
I'm Kandis, and I run Cassandra Press. So today I'm going to kind of tell you guys about the press accepts his offer to sleep with him and then kind of reneges once apparently she was a priestess for Apollo, which meant that she was chaste.
It's the story of Cassandra.
Their life. Apollo fell in love with her and asked her basically to sleep with him, and she denied him because she worshipped him. So interestingly enough, he rapes her, spits in her mouth, and gives her the gift of prophecy. So this is like kind of a hardcore version. In the more hardcore version, she accepts his offer to sleep with him and then kind of reneges once she gets the gift of prophecy, and then he curses her with deniability. So either way you slice it, Cassandra's kind of fucked. And, she basically lives this chaste life. She becomes this powerful prophetess, and then she's cursed with deniability. So Apollo can't take her divine power away from her, and so he negates it by basically stopping her from being believed. And this is like kind of her fate. Interestingly enough, Cassandra has a twin brother named Helenus, who she also teaches the gift of prophecy, who is believed, to further add insult to injury.
So that was the Pirate Care Conference. This was a conference of various kind of like digital bootleggers that were, or like different bootleggers from all over the world that were really super interestingly organized. I got to participate in that in 2019. Lockdown. This was our first solo show at Printed Matter in 2020, January 2020. Waited months. So Cassandra's taken a lot of different forms of like sort of public display. And this is a solo show called The Field. This is like my sort of private studio. Cassandra's also weirdly like not an alter ego, not a side project, but something else. So I'm often asked to be like in participation as Cassandra and as my own studio, which I think is a very interesting, I mean, sort of not even up to me, right? Like just a very interesting curatorial trend that I'm sure will catch up with me.
Maybe I can jump in there, Kandis, or if I don't want to interrupt you, but...
Sorry?
Maybe I can jump in there with another question, but I don't want to interrupt your flow.
I'll just keep going through images. But go ahead.
No, first of all, thank you that you kind of so well described your very transdisciplinary approach to kind of collage at large. And I also felt like you said something that this kind of the collage or deconstruction of the image, or you said degrading of the image, I totally sense in your work, and also somehow making visible of like intentionality inside the images. And I'm speaking both formally as well as conceptually speaking here, no? I think that really resonates powerfully in throughout all the work that we've seen before. And picking up on the Cassandra Press, actually I would love to talk about media culture a little bit with you, because what I find so fascinating when kind of trying to work myself into your practice, that is like it's a very like dense, academically enforced artistic language, but that needs a really deep understanding of contemporary social media culture. Yeah, so you have this also really prolific use of different media in your artistic practice, and we spoke about this actually on Friday with Hans Ulrich as well. And I have to admit, the only reason why I started TikTok now is because of you. Because following your like Instagram stories, you have so many like amazing TikTok stories in there that I was like, shit, this might be actually a medium that I've totally underrated. Maybe it's much more dialogical than I thought. And the same for the Cassandra Press, because as you said, it's like bootleg, basically sources of information that you have there from really like analytical or philosophical text to like screenshots from Twitter or from I don't know, various social media. Yeah, so can you elaborate on this kind of on your use of social media and the mix of media and their also inherent capacities or incapacities?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think there's a really thin veil, right, between my studio work and Cassandra. And I think about the double consciousness and the veil that Du Bois talks about. And the double consciousness is almost kind of a blip in his theoretical frameworking. And I think we have, I think Bracha Ettinger is like another theorist that I think a lot about, who understands kind of fascination. And she has a term like fascinance, actually, that's like a term to describe how the subject is related to the gaze, the voyeurism, and the intimate structure of the other, like the I and the non-I is her theory. So I think somewhere in between, like using a kind of like Ettingerian kind of like sense of what selfhood is, and this greater like sort of cultural or collective Du Boisian understanding of the veil that racism produces in the like internalization, almost like cipher of the subject. There's like of the subject building and self-building. There's like a sweet spot in the work where I've like almost created, I think, two double consciousnesses or something, or I think that's also like my obsession with the square and the grid almost, and tying affect theory to media theory and aesthetic theory really, obliquely. I think that is the work of a lot of activism, actually, has been untangling the use of media as the rhetorical structure for building white supremacist ideology. So like we really need to go back into our media as material and decode what structures of self are produced, right? Like what self-building structures are produced by the dissemination, the production, the mythopoetics, right, generated from all of these media. None of these things are not in tandem. All of these things are in tandem with the production of self and other, right? And I think there's like, for me, I think that spot in between Cassandra and the studio are like two different reactions almost to being trapped in that racial dialogic as a Black body moving through space, and then as a person. You know, I allow in my studio practice, I think I allow for a kind of like, I mean, I think for a long time thinking about nationality and violence and sort of like hypersexuality, I allow for an amount of violence in how I construct images almost like privately in my own sort of like necro imagination. So when I'm composing images in the studio, like those plexi images you've seen, they all come out of like very intensely, you know, how like sort of media as a material has impacted me as a person, almost like an internal archive. And then Cassandra allows me to sort of exteriorize a lot of those propositions. And Cassandra's way more, I don't even need the violence, right, of a lot of composition. Like Cassandra stays pretty regimented in a grid in most ways, you know, like, so we lay out text, and I can lay out text in a very sort of like sequential order. I can fuck around with that sequence of text, like images. The images, you know, speak very loudly for themselves once they're in context, they're in association with one another. So it really is about framing. It really is about framing. This is a show where we unpack Sanford Bigger's work around the Amistad Research Center. I also like, who even knows how to describe what we did in this project, right? Like the Rivers Institute approached us about going through the Amistad's, like I think over 70,000 part collection for works that resonated, essentially to draw out a visual reader for Sanford Bigger's show at CAM, retrospective at CAM. So we made a Bigger's reader and then pulled from, like, sort of again spatially oriented and designed the space to reflect images that we pulled from the archive, resonated with Bigger's work. So like a sort of research, or I guess architecture is at play here. Again, I'm really, you know, I think keeping in mind that I work in so many different contexts. Just to shy away from any sort of like moralistic or even like didactic approach to understanding what collage does, I'm far from that. Like, I feel like what's happening now is that associative qualities and phenomenological qualities around certain associations and their digestibility, the access points to them, their entanglement with white supremacist ideology, their entanglements with colonial ideology, the very essence of dialogic versus static, and how the image contains or perpetuates that. Like, I feel like that is you know, a question that we see from, you know, institutional interest in the archive through what's probably coming up this next year of, like, you know, an investigation of monumentality, monument removal. I think we're trying to understand and build group and collective language for the violence of genocidal, the logic of evisceration that we experience as a collective around certain representation, and aesthetics is guilty, right, of helping perpetuate so many of those confusions and obscurings of who the subject and who the author are. This is the show I just opened at David Zorner on dance and movement. Performance being another space, right, where there's so much entangled and non-moralistic, right, so many pluralistic impulses, intentions. The media becomes material for various audiences, sort of like prismatically. So there's a lot kind of like there in the practice that I'm still questioning. So
Yeah, can I pick up on the notion of the archive? It's obviously a huge topic for you, and you just said that the Cassandra Press is in a way your external archive and your artistic practice more the internal archive. Kind of paraphrasing you, what you said before. And obviously we've seen these, like in particular, one of the last works you showed us, the absolute right to exclude. We've seen this huge archive of images. Oh, sorry, you're showing this film right now.
No, it's okay. I'll just play this while you're talking.
This is sorry, no. We have to. This is so beautiful. This is Saul Williams, no? For the
Louis, but the first time we collaborated.
Yeah, okay, no. I'll ask my question afterwards. Too beautiful to see, but we don't hear the sound.
Please ask. It's like 12 minutes long. I'll play the
Okay,
sound.
good. Well, then we leave this in the background. Anyways, it's a beautiful short film. I was totally mesmerized when it came out. I was such a big fan of Saul Williams. I remember seeing that Slam movie in, I don't know, the early 90s. Totally got me. No, I was saying your work around archives or the notion of the archives, I would like to kind of dive in with you a little bit, because you often your work often deals, so it seems, with like institutional archival history, and then history written with a big ass H, capital H. Yeah. But it appears in a way that you are thereby creating like very vast and very rigorous non-institutional archives in plural with the S of histories with a small h, so to speak, like a really dense network of kind of interrelations and disruptions that kind of then explores the history of colonization and the control of Black and non-white bodies. And most recently, you showed a few works of them as well, the exploitation also of the natural world. And looking at them, it feels like it's a deeply researched archive or archives of visual histories that kind of almost collapse onto one another. Do I get that right?
I don't think that they collapse onto one another. Actually, I feel like I think we have to understand one is like a Rodriguez term called the logic of evisceration. And I think in understanding, this term, like that certain genocidal practices are not anomalies, right? That most of our society is structured around the production of genocidal policy, the preservation of genocidal policy, right? Like the West is the ethos, the pathos, the everything kind of like all gears talk about the means of production, right? And that's interesting. I think a phenomenological, really intense phenomenological intensity, right, of collage is that the West is built on a kind of dissonance, right, a kind of double speak, a kind of two-sidedness, right, from the Enlightenment, most vividly straight through all of our white supremacist ideologies today, our patriarchal policies of kind of paterfamilias of the Roman Empire, like we see a kind of violence called protection, right? We see an ultimate will to the power of few called progress. We see the decimation of indigeneity called purification, right? So we live in so much, and white supremacist discourse gives us so much of this dissonance, right? So much of the power of that dissonance comes from political propaganda that's used to control us or control and create so much production. This is why I think, thinking about collage, especially as a means of cultural production, I think we have to demoralize that, right? Because propaganda does the same thing with associative sort of replacements, like, thinking about even colorism and the production right now of so many different means of cultural diversity and inclusion that incorporate only, light-skinned Black women from throughout the diaspora, right, as cultural ambassadors for Blackness, that further produces this is the logic of evisceration, essentially, right? It's like it is all that tricky, amorphous. It produces all that poetic, right? A poetic, a genocidal poetic that has intense power, right? So there are so many blind spots, I think, in terms of that phenomenology as well, where like when we call a kind of like attention to those places of dissonance and we apply some pressure, and I don't think that means that those histories turn into smaller histories or that they're, I think what we understand more is how impacted a lot of that erasure is phenomenologically in the production of accessible language, right? Of most accessible language. We know that there's not access for like the disabled. We know that there's not access for the indigenous. We know that there's not access for so many of the people of the margin, and yet we understand like access, whitewashing, the production of you know, translations from indigenous languages into English. We understand all of that is universalizing as much as we understand it as violent. So I don't think that those histories unpack like that or disperse like that. I think they are so they're compounded into unrealities, right? They're compounded into fictions, nationalist fictions. And it's interesting also thinking about fashion and with this kind of like dramaturgical intervention. I think the only thing I was really, able to provide through like, writing and dramaturgy on these projects was a sense of like a kind of like bird's eye view of like almost like, in Edingarian term too, like an erotic aerial of the kind of psyche of a lot of these interventions of the Black body on sort of modernist tropes, right, of power and social organization. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's a way where like this work, like further obscures, like a lot of the references, like, and seeing, something like a reader go from a reader, through writing rooms and, corporate intervention and then into production at this caliber was very interesting, right? Because it's that question again of what is the power of collage, right? What is the power of just putting two images together? And I think that there is, there's a phenomenological kind of like gap that Blackness occupies, right? Where like there's a lot of that dissonance and a lot of that power, even thinking about the commodification of like the Black body and the birth of cool, very fraught, moralistic propositions, right? But they are extremely powerful and extremely potent social organizational propositions, which has led me into fashion and a lot of interest, or gives me an interest in fashion, right, is that these are, means of social access that while they remain extremely dissonant, don't begin that way, like have very nuanced social origins, so I wouldn't say even that they break apart into smaller histories. I would say these social histories really are the bedrock of a lot of the more degraded images, right? A lot of the more, say useless, but, non-utilitarian, especially for activist purposes, images, right? They end up calling social order into production, like maybe like not necessarily culture, but social order. Thinking about culture that I super deeply disagree with, which is like the sort of like Kanye West, Kardashian culture. And a lot of those propositions about social dominance that are displayed there, like, I still feel like, like there is almost like a semiotic pipeline that Blackness occupies that allows, my work to exist and those lives to exist and, these mood boards, these collage spaces, these associative spaces to be completely shared. Can you see this now? The triadic?
No, I can see the Vimeo page now. No.
Okay,
no,
you're...
Yeah, but it's beautiful to see how your collage brain works, no? And I'm always fascinated that, though we kind of still tend to think of ourselves as like really coherent beings, no? Kandis, Lukas, and so forth, and believe that our awareness is also like a continuous mental state. we're actually constantly evolving, no? Like human consciousness is an ever changing collage or cut up of mental fragments that are held together by a very fluctuating sense of self. No, even like neurological studies kind of show that memory, imagination, consciousness are themselves like stitched up, basically. They're quilted, they're pastiched.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that all is all, you know, I mean, so I think about Catherine McKittrick, which I thought a lot about with this movement project for 52 Walker for a line. But yeah, there's a lot of, I think, presuppositions or scientific sort of like inquiry that are also based in this logic of evisceration that, you know, almost like produce this dissonance around the acceptance of, you know, various temporal states that are, yeah, just sort of like obviously very important to sort of like human cognition, right? In lieu of a methodology to sort of prove their scientific function. So even thinking about dance and like the way that we as beings occupy time through movement lineage or through oral histories versus through image histories, right? Like there's a kind of hegemony at play in all of that language. I see there's some questions in the chat.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I wanted to jump back into. Are you back in the game?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, cool. So yeah, maybe we can actually go to the questions from the students here. The first one is, how do you make your readers available to people who cannot afford them?
I just give them to them if they ask.
Okay, that's the easy one. And why, if your goal is to somehow deploy these entanglements between white supremacy, privilege, and vernacular culture, do you choose to remain in those centers of white power?
So I'd ask, like, what do they mean by remain?
Augusto?
I mean that you live in New York and you define New York as the center of the world. Then you say that you live in LA and then you live in Berlin. Why you stay in these white power supremacist places where this power is like obviously the settled power? Why do you move? You don't move to another place to understand the borders, to understand another kind of practice?
I guess I would say that those borders or those other sort of places and other practices aren't not impacted by white supremacy. In fact, I just spent a month in Accra. I just got back like a couple days ago. And I've traveled all over the world. And I'm from also a decentralized place of power. I'm from a black city. I grew up in a black city. I'm from a black island, from Trinidad. So I would question you to interrogate what your idea of remaining is and what your idea of sort of like being centered by those powers means. Because I also feel like there's ways in which the phenomenology of having dark skin, right, is something that I carry everywhere. And there is no way to decenter that as a lived experience. And it is an experience that is completely shaped by the vernacular of white supremacy, right, of an entanglement with privilege. And then I also feel like there's a question every artist, I mean, I think maybe also one of the underlying sort of like feelings in your question is about what it is to be a non-white artist and occupy space in, like I was referring to, like with saying my, you know, I think talking about New York as the center of the world, I was referring to my own naivety. I was referring to my own youth. And in my youth, you know, sort of like not understanding that there were other centers of intellectual thought. Now I'm very aware, you know, that especially, you know, white urban city spaces are not, yeah, are full of this logic of evisceration, right? Actively, like I lived through 2020 America. So yeah, I think there's a a sentiment there about remaining that I think also we could, understand as resistance, that we can also understand as, I think through I and non-I as well, right? Like how much internalization, how much externalization, external power, how much scopic regimes and those sorts of colonial intersectional cultural contexts shape and remain with certain bodies, right? And then don't, or maybe are less, or sort of like, or easier to untangle, right, around different bodies. One, kind of like, I think thought process for you maybe would be to think about the disabled community, right? As able-bodied people, we often sort of fantasize, right? Especially in terms of sort of activists versus complicit kind of bystander binary, right? That there's an option for migration, that there's a moral obligation, right, to move if one is opposed to a government, opposed to a social hierarchy, opposed to a locale or a regime of rule. But I mean, think about what most people understand, like through a life of disability, and that ability to remain is a question of survival. The option to move is not available to us all. And I think there's a lot of those. Again, these are genocidal poetics, even in that interrogation, right, of why I would remain. I think underlying it is an affect of being sort of like surprised at a Black femme's success, right? Like, especially in these markets. And I think there's more to interrogate there, for sure.
Yeah, I feel the same. There's another question to follow up with. I would like to know more about your practice on performance art and what brought you into that art form. And maybe right now we can stop with the screen sharing because we have the movie stopped in the background. Yeah, practice on performance art and how you got there.
Performance, like I said, I think I answered that in the beginning. I've just been really always invested in performance and performativity. I grew up in a place, that was like a Black radio city. So there was a lot of the investment in performance there.
Yeah. And Katarina would like to know more about the approach in exhibiting video art film. How does the installation influence the viewer? Which mode of viewing is provoked?
Can you ask it again?
I'd like to know more about the approach in exhibiting video art film. How does the installation influence the viewer? Which mode of viewing is provoked? I guess the spatial installation.
Well, I mean, I've always thought about that in terms of also like, access and the incorporation of the image to like a movement, or is kind of like trigger of an audience's movement. So I think, and throughout a lot of the different performances I've done, I've like sort of thought through how a lot of, I mean, even in the soundtrack to this movie, there's a lot of the haptic sounds, like the vibrating sounds from various cell phone rings and notification sounds. So they're sounds that incorporate some sort of vibration or buzz. Produces a buzz in the speaker. And I'm really interested in them because I think they do, they throw kind of like the image into the body. And I think I'm really interested in that in terms of collage and the cut and the edge, like certain edges, I think do throw the image into the body, certain say the plants, for instance, like certain combinations of images throw the image back into the body. And I think as a way to sort of like elicit various responses in whatever I'm interested in the image, part of what I do to strategize is to make it, to sort of like figure out where in the body it lies. I don't know how to say that, but like where in the body that image provokes. I think that's somehow part of like what I've studied from Leotard, from the libidinal economy, that like if sort of like any principles of psychosomatic or like psychological kind of like intensity or entanglement, like means of interrogating, right, those psychological intensities result in physical, distress. They also result in physical excitement. I guess there's sort of a basis of sort of sensorial affect theory there. But, certain images, certain colors, I think that's part of my Bauhaus education also, is like that, we can kind of like sense a cartography of like, it's also sort of a, kind of like, I think not a post-colonial understanding of certain image making models, right? That like there's a sense of violence that certain colonial subjects can inhabit. So there's a certain like sense of how certain even like color patterns or color schemes, right, will invite a kind of threat modeling even on the Black or brown or indigenous subject, because we've recognized ourselves, right, as colonial violence in certain compositions, in certain sepia tones, and certain, gray scales, right? Like we've recognized these images of violence for so long that they almost become, lodged in the body. So I think I play around with that. Like where the sort of image, where the image resides within the body. If it's something that hits you in your gut, in your throat, in your heart, and sort of playing around with the affect of images, like in that, and as a means of composing them in matter.
And we can follow up with the last two questions from the students. Maybe continuing on the last one, do you have some advice on creating a performance piece, or what you think are important things to integrate while creating one?
Yeah, I guess all the stuff that I'm talking about, I think all the stuff I'm talking about is like, I think what helps performance make sense in terms of cultural memory, cultural identity, opens up like the possibility around the body to not just perform the culture it's from or produced by, but to, sort of like open up questions of what culture is, like if you are sort of like basing, and I mean, I think that's what I do with dramaturgy, especially. It's like sort of like research-based projects allow me to produce movement that I think has more textual echo, So being able to isolate certain aesthetics of the image, I think that you feel in the body, or that one feels in their body, right? Like dealing with, especially the libidinal, like when I think about performance, so much of the importance of what our bodies are doing are produced by a semiotic mountain, right, of signifiers, icons, hypo-icons, images that we've seen millions of versus images that we've seen once. Biographical versus this like kind of like cultural indexical. So yeah, so when you make performance, it's like no one cares about a girl sitting in a field, right? It's like, but then you think about Becky, Karen, Nike, Athena, like what field, what's the presence of, the presence of certain positions, postures, right? The girl standing in a field holding a stick of fire, like all of a sudden conjures like everything from the Hunger Games to like Athena, like, so there's all those, there's every image has an index, I think that's what Blackness actually kind of has, is that it can move almost volcanically as a substance because of all the hyper signification and this logic of evisceration and externalized political force and density. Like Blackness kind of circumvents the large layer of common signifier into the icon. means of iconic recognition or something like that.
Mm.
Quite quickly, right? Like how someone like Breonna Taylor can go from being a person to being bannerized and made into a flag and T-shirts, right? Like there is the threat of that for all Black bodies, right? That genocidal poetic that lodges us perpetually in iconic space. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Actually, I'm getting even text messages with questions to you right now. You're definitely multimedia here. So my colleague Timothy Ingen, who's here from the University of Arts, is asking, how do young European artists participate in the emancipation from white suprematic visual cultures on their own terms?
I don't know. I feel like there's a really interesting part of the Rodriguez. This text, maybe I'll make it available to you if you can read this.
Yeah, I'd love to. I can share it with the students.
Yeah, it's called, yeah, it's Dylan Rodriguez, Inhabiting the Impasse. Pull it up.
Otherwise, you can also send it to me afterwards and I'll pass it along.
Yeah, send it to you. But it's I think it's available. It's on Semantic Scholar. The full title is Inhabiting the Impasse, Racial Colonial Power, Genocide, Poetics, and the Logic of Evisceration. So if you get a chance, you should check that out. Let's put this thing. Anyway. Yeah, I think as white people, as European descendants, I think understanding, white savior complexes, understanding, that decolonization is not a metaphorical extensions of various activations of calls for decolonization don't apply to your person, right? Because a lot of that, a lot of primitivism, a lot of like escapism, a lot of unaccountability, a lot of fetishism, right, has really produced the primitive other as the space of white liberty or white freedom, white sexual freedom, like white libidinal currency. So I think an interrogation of your own desire is paramount, and I think an interrogation of the desires of your forefathers, of your families, is paramount. Really, like a deep looking inside of and production of language for the violence of your intimate space. And, I think that alone, right, like, it's funny, in the Rodriguez text, he talks about sort of like the family drama that is white supremacist racial colonial power, right? It's like watching sort of like white Western European powers cut the world up. I mean, even this question, even of being asked why I would remain in white spaces, is so insulting. Like what part of the world has not been dominated and touched by white supremacy? That even that means of an imaginary moralistic dilemma that I'm supposed to face as it is a total fiction, right? Like there's social movement, right? But then there's also social reproduction of a lot of that, of a lot of those binaries with movement, right? So there's patriarchy that follows, marginal communities that have been touched by imperialism that still result in femicide. There's, economic sort of like struggles that are economic praxis, right? Brutality, economic slavery, sex trafficking that's perpetuated intercommunity because of caste and race dynamics that we have yet to produce common language for, right? There are violences within all of our intimate spaces. And And I think for white people, for white bodies, really getting to the root of a lot of those historical anomalies, right? Like what we understand to be horrific acts of genocide that are actually every single day happening in your kitchens, in your living rooms, in your homes, in your bank accounts, right? In your inheritances, in the land that you own, in the land that you'll inherit. And I think, like definitely pulling apart how various sort of resistance-based cultures that live under genocidal oppression, don't produce language for that personal fiction, right? Like don't produce language for you to understand your character as maybe like a person who's subjugated to social oppression or social discomfort. The appropriation of activist languages by white intellectuals is like, I think, one of the most dense erasures of material political progress, right? Like the whitewashing of social narratives of especially marginal social narratives produces their further domination by white supremacist discourse. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's a necessity to like get real and be fucking real. I mean, when I was younger, I would tell people all the time, like, go home and kill your dad. Honestly, if y'all want to get rid of it, you want to get rid of it. It could be gone in like one generation. You stop reproducing. I don't know. You know what I mean? If that's like, if you want a radical, like intense, whatever, like proposition for that, if your dad owns a chemical research company, go home and pop him. I don't know. Not to call for that. You know what I mean? Because I can't legally. Right? But like, there are so many ways where like the call for radical action comes from the desperation for change. And I think feeling that desperation as a white body is one of the, hardest propositions for like such an advantageous position in this global economy, right? Like so many advantages that you inherit are going to be really hard to look in the face and end or walk away from. And I don't have any advice for that, really. You know what I mean? I just make readers.
Speaking of advice and coming also towards an end, I think Danny was raising the hand, but the connection is breaking up. And I think, Niels, your question about the double identity is basically what Kandis just replied to as well, about kind of these kind of binaries. Kandis, I mean, you had a very rough advice here right now, but we have this tradition of the last question for our speakers is to ask them for an advice for all the becoming artists, architects, performers, musicians, designers, etc. that are listening today. So what piece of advice could you give all of them?
Keep your head low and make your work, I guess, I think there's a lot to be said for, I think, having the sensitivity of wanting to do this work anyway. Like you're young artists, you're people dealing in sensitivities, I guess. You're learning sensitivities, whether you kind of like it or not. And it's a really hard world. So I think there's a real like almost like burden put on young artists to like explain it all or produce solutions, right? And you can beat your head into the wall with that because you're often hands tied behind your back. You'll have the least resources you'll ever have in your life in your youth. And you're expected, to carry so much of the future of meaning making and meaning production, right? Of cultural production. And that's not fair. And that's not practical, right? So that's almost the folly. That's what I would tell young artists is like, keep your head down and make the work that you care about. Don't try to make the work that everyone cares about. And that's like, find your place. It doesn't, there's nothing, there's no rush, to make work that everyone sees, that everyone shares, that everyone, I think there's like a real, culture of virality and in kind of a really intense lack of focus. and it can be quite distracting, I think, like, so make your time to do what you want to do, whether that's reading or, playing the lyre or textile production, whatever it is that makes you, that makes you do what you want to do. Like, I think figure out that versus an external thesis, because you will always have time for that. And history is nothing but that. You'll always have your muses, you'll always have your inspirations, right? If you look at history, if you look at your peers who are doing what you're doing, and there's always time to relate to culture at large. But if you're producing what you're producing, like, go in 100% and do that, and just follow that and trust that, because it's that bond to what you're doing and what you're making is going to be so much more important than a press release, so much more important than a share, so much more important than being a part of a hashtag. Yeah, and I think, whether it pays off today, tomorrow, and 50 years, like, those are the artists' lives worth living. To do that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Kandis. Thank you so much for taking your time right now, no? And thank you for everything, all the advice, also the intimacy of this conversation. I really appreciate this. Thank you guys. Thank you everyone for joining in again. We're back in our Monday evening routine. And thank you for being here. Kandis, thanks again. It was beautiful. And I hope to see you all next Monday again. We have another, I think, exciting evening. It's going to be with Nicolas Bourriot, the French curator and art critic. I think we will talk about forms of collage and cut-up as modes of contemporary cultural production again next Monday. But a big applause to Kandis again. Really, really appreciate it. You take care. Stay safe, guys. Bye.